Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm going to be playing a brand new game just out on Matrix and Slitherine's website. It's a game made by Western Civilization Software, the creators of Forge of Freedom, an absolute epic Civil War game, which looks at the entire Civil War from a very detailed perspective. Brother Against Brother, The Drawing of the Sword, as the game is called, is a very different game. It's a game that looks at the Civil War in a much smaller manner, yet no less detailed. It's just the game focuses on tactical combat as opposed to kind of the entire war. And it also focuses, as the title would perhaps give you a hint, on the smaller scale actions of the early war period, so 1861 to 1862. It does have multiplayer available. I believe it's play by email. I haven't given that a look yet. Other than that, a pretty Spartan main menu there. As you can see here, if we go into the scenarios and battles, there's no real campaign to the game, but it does have several well thought out and incredibly well researched battles included in the game. You see battles such as First Manassas, Williamsburg up there on the top is kind of the tutorial, specifically Hancock versus Early, the Hancock flank march at the Battle of Williamsburg. But the game includes the Battle of First Manassas, the Battle of Mill Springs, Williamsburg, Wilson's Creek. These are all battles which took place in 1861 and early 1862, before a lot of the major fights. The only real major fight in here is Bull Run, although Wilson's Creek was a pretty decent sized engagement. Williamsburg is a 1862 engagement in the early days of the Peninsula Campaign, as the Union started moving up the peninsula when the Confederate Army was still under the command of General Joseph Johnston before Lee took over, kind of just past Yorktown, I want to say. For this video, I'm going to just kind of take an initial look at this game. I'm going to play as the Union, and I'm going to play the scenario where you play as Winfield Hancock. You attempt to roll up the Confederate left flank following a circuitous route march that took you to an undefended part of the battlefield. The Confederates' flank is basically Hancock's marching around the Confederate flank, and the Confederates attempt to counterattack him. Essentially, if the Confederates can't drive him back, it risks the entire Confederate flank being rolled up, and also risking the Confederate Army's ability to withdraw toward Richmond. So this is actually an interesting little fight. It's not the tutorial, it's the same scenario as the tutorial, just without all the hints and everything built into the game. And this scenario I picked for one because I'm a really big Winfield Scott Hancock fan when it comes to Civil War history. He's a guy who I find very interesting, very fascinating, was unique among Union Corps commanders in that he fought as a Corps commander for all three. Well, when he became a Corps commander in '63, he stayed that in the Army of the Potomac all the way through the conclusion of the war for the most part. Health reasons caused him to be pulled out near the very end of the war. But was probably the best Union Corps commander in the Army of the Potomac. Certainly the most accomplished, in that he accomplished more positive for the Union armies than anyone else. He might not have been the most talented, but had the most illustrious career. You can see here as we kind of navigate around this map, this is a much larger map. There is a full Williamsburg scenario. There's also quite a few alternate history scenarios for all of these battles. So while maybe the game only focuses on, 4 battles, it has over 20 scenarios, I believe, I want to say, with a bunch of alternate historical scenarios as well. You can see here, we've got our units are represented. I'm going to zoom out here for a second so I can kind of scroll around. You can see if you zoom out a bit, the contours of your units change to NATO color or NATO style. So they kind of have like a 2D artistic impression when you zoom in, and when you zoom out, they've got more of a traditional board game type look with NATO counters. But anyway, for I think the first thing we're going to do here, we're going to change our brigade's movement orders. Right now they're set to advance. You can see here we've got multiple different options that Hancock can change his orders to. You can make the decision to change his orders. And a couple of different options here. But we're going to change it to March Column, which gives us basically greater movement range, but we can't really effectively fight in it. Still, I want to try and get the entire brigade up and into position as quickly as we can. So we'll take this battalion here of about 210 men, The unit information is on the lower left-hand corner of the screen. You even get information such as, you know, the types of weapons that the units are using. We're going to go ahead and move General Smith, General William Baldy Smith, who's in command of the division that Hancock is a part of. Hancock's a brigade commander in this scenario. And we'll move him closer toward the main front. We're also going to take the 7th Maine, move them into a column formation. You can see there that percentage, 95%, is the chance of successfully changing into that formation, and you can see we did that. And we're going to go ahead and march along this road all the way back up to where the rest of the brigade is. That regiment was guarding our flank along a road through the woods that would have gone to our rear. That's why I'm bringing up that battalion that I had first moved. And now you can see here that as my units have moved into marching column, they're limited with how close they can move to an enemy. They can't be closer than 4 hexes to an enemy unit. They can't charge, and non-artillery units, I don't remember what the rest of that said, but essentially different movement rules give you different abilities. So marching might allow you to march greater distances, but you basically have combat penalties as well. So you can see here we've got another regiment, the 33rd New York, that we're going to go ahead and we're going to move them closer to the front. Again, the main reason I changed my orders for my brigade is I want to make sure that I can get everybody up. I've already mentioned this, but it's worth noting that the command level in this game is at a regimental level. You can split regiments for that matter, so you could split a regiment into 2 halves if you need to cover more frontage, which is basically, you know, if you need to cover more ground with your units so that they can be spread out more thin to cover a longer line, you can split your regiments into kind of, I don't know if they'd really be a battalion, but they'd be a detached, you know, your regiment with 2 halves over a longer period. Or you can just keep them in kind of their main combat formation there. So we moved everybody, and now you can see we've got a battle order that's popped up here. So the 5th Wisconsin Infantry is counterattacking the 6th South Carolina. You get a whole bunch of information. You get a whole bunch of modifiers, which is really kind of neat. This little firefight details tab on the bottom reminds me a lot of some board games where you've got these different attack tables that are really difficult to go through. I've never been someone who's all that into board games, but I think the fact that you see the details and how the combat kind of breaks down and how the modifiers affect the actual fighting, I think that's a really neat feature for a game like this to have, because often in computer games, so much is going on underneath the hood that it's really difficult, especially in war games, to really understand what's going on. If you want to know why things are happening the way they are, if you're that type of person who's really into kind of knowing the details, a lot of times board games appeal to you because there's very clear rules. Sometimes they're very, very deep and hard to get through, but they tell you exactly why things are happening the way that they're happening. And in this case, this game does provide that right down there in the firefight details. You can get a summary of everything you need in the top, where it just kind of gives like the effective strength, the firing, you know, what's engaging, and then the die roll, the 50%. It'll also give you casualties there as well. And on the right side of the screen, you get some additional information, such as the terrain that's underneath, you know, the unit that you're selected on, and that changes, you know, wherever you click your mouse as well. But here you can see total damage. It tells you the damage that was affected when someone is killed or wounded, and then you've also got modifiers to morale, which will determine when a unit kind of withdraws or fights or what have you. You also get a summary at the end of the turn that kind of tells you what's going on here. You can see 0 Union casualties, 1 Confederate casualty, and then the turn moves on. Now, turns are broken into 2 separate halves. You've got the half basically where Union movement or Union units make their attacks, I suppose, and also Confederate units. Although I don't quite, admittedly, understand it because both sides still shoot at each other. So it's almost like the Union moves, and then units fight and engage, and then the Confederates move and fight and engage. So it's a turn-based structure. Each turn takes about 20 minutes, but it's not really we go. It's kind of Union moves, they fire, and the Confederates respond fire, and then the Confederates move and fire and respond fire. You can get random events like this one here that pops up that tells us a Confederate artillery shell destroyed a Union wagon that destroyed 15 supply. So, supply is another aspect to the game. It wasn't actually... Oh yeah, it was. You can see we scroll down there and it gives us a little summary that unit lost some wagon or what have you to a lucky artillery fire. And those are other kind of random things or little alerts that pop up that tell you that. Where was I again? I don't even remember what I was discussing here as we kind of roll through. But basically, turns represent about a 20-minute period of time. So the first turn started at 3, the next turn will start at 3:20. And as I said, you get a summary on each turn, so you kind of get some units that are unable to attack. You get a summary of casualties. You can see there the U.S. lost 1 casualty that turn, and the time is now 3:20 p.m. Well, another thing that the game has in spades is detail. So we're going to move back into an assault phase, which you can see here, useful for closing into contact with the enemy units and inflicting maximum damage. Units move at 50% of normal movement, can attempt to form lines without losing movement points, and inflict 25% more combat damage. So we could do that. Originally, our units were in an advanced mode, which basically allows you to advance toward an enemy kind of as a balance between marching and attacking. You can attack more effectively, but you can't move as far. Assault basically allows you to move real close in, and if you want, you can charge the enemy. And now you can see that we've got a whole bunch of options. So we'll go here. Little blue hexes, little kind of faint blue hexes represent where you can march to. And I believe the circles with a plus kind of in the middle, with like that cross in the middle of them, represent areas that your troops can fire. So it lets you see essentially where you can shoot to. The plus without the circle, I believe, and don't quote me because admittedly, this is just a first impressions video. I haven't looked through everything in the game yet, nor all of the manual, but I believe that's more of like line of sight, or where maybe you can move, but not... No, that wouldn't make sense. I believe it's more kind of a line of sight thing, because it goes way beyond what you can shoot at in some situations. So you can see there we're moving these troops in column formation toward this road here in the woods to guard our right flank. Just a battalion of about 200 men. Then we're moving our division commander, William Baldy Smith, forward to provide support. Now this game is incredibly detailed. You can see here there's a little bit of haze on the map. That's to represent smoke from units now being engaged. So one of the things that was always very difficult in a Civil War battlefield was the smoke that would kind of build up slowly in an engagement and often obscure huge portions of the battlefield or units from each other. This is pre-smokeless powder warfare, so the combat was very dirty and very difficult to communicate and see sometimes. You can see here we're going to go ahead and end the turn, and again we'll get the Union resolution of its turn, and then the Confederates will get to move and do their thing, and they'll fight again. I don't know, maybe this is a common way for turns to be resolved. It's not something that I'm used to, but it's alright. I mean, it's not something that bothers me, it's just a little bit different. So you can see there, you've got an average morale, and our morale will break. So up at the very top of the screen, it's got the date, it's got the time, it tells you when the scenario ends. So it started at 3 p.m. on 5/5, so May 5th, 1862, ends on May 5th, 1862 at 7 p.m. Average morale of all of our units is 3.33. Our morale will break at 150. I assume that means that, you know, at that level, all of our units will rout from the field. And again, at 20-minute increments, that gives us, 4 hours? So it gives us 12 turns or so. My math way off on that. Three turns to an hour, and then 4 hours. So yeah, 3 times 12. Okay, doing basic math on the Historical Gamer podcast. Not podcast, what the hell? On the Historical Gamer YouTube channel. You can see here the turn ended with us losing 4 casualties to the Confederates 3. Casualties will gradually mount as units move in closer. One of the things you may have noticed is this rain graphic on the outside of the map. Sound also periodically will jump in with raining noises. I hope it's not too annoying. I've kind of lowered the volume down a bit. The game has some interesting music as well. Those are all just nice little touches that the game includes to kind of add a sense of immersion to the game. At the bottom of the screen, I mentioned previously, you can see that on the unit currently on screen, column formation is selected, there's line formation. You can also form skirmisher formation. There's an ability to build hasty entrenchments in some engagements. You can tell your units whether you want them to charge. Yes, you know, basically never, may, maybe, essentially if the situation warrants it, or yes, always. In addition to that, you've also got the ability to surrender, which why on earth would we do that? And split your unit as well, which I already previously mentioned. End your turn, and you also can get like a combat summary, I believe, for that unit, and also for the entire battle as well. Top right, where it says USA score and CSA score, represents the score of the game. You earn score by taking victory locations, essentially little stars with circles around them on the map. You also have modifiers to those scores based on casualties, so that's something that will build up. Smoke, as you can see, already represented on the map. You get a little red 3 over Confederate units, in addition to the little pop-up that'll tell you how many men are being lost. Little blue numbers will pop up by the Union unit that's engaged, representing how many Union casualties are lost. Williamsburg was an interesting battle in that it was fought in the middle of a storm. There weren't, I can't think of that many Confederate battles, or not Confederate or Union, or well, I guess they have to be Confederate and Union, wouldn't they? Can't think of many Civil War battles that took place in the middle of storms. One part of that is because of the fact that obviously, you know, in the age of black powder, if your powder gets wet, you're going to have a hard time fighting a battle. There was an engagement at Spotsylvania Courthouse that took place in a downpour. There was also one, what's the name of it? I think I did a video on it a year or two ago. It's part of the Second Manassas campaign. After the Union Army had been driven from the field, there was a rear guard action. What is it? Chantley, I believe is how it's pronounced. That was fought in the middle of a thunderstorm as well. Now you can see here, it gives us a percentage chance of our changing formation to be successful. I just clicked on change into line formation, but there was a 0% chance that we would succeed. So I don't know why I bothered doing that. Meanwhile, continuing to move the 33rd New York of Corning's battalion of that regiment to our flank to guard that road from any kind of adventurous rebels. Move Hancock forward. We'll also move Khusro forward. Khusro commands the 2 artillery batteries there, Battery E and the 1st Battalion of Artillery. William Baldy Smith, the division commander, will move him forward. Different commanders have different skills. Some of them are better than others. Hancock is a very good commander. As I mentioned, he was one of the best Union Corps commanders. As a brigade commander, he was also fantastic. The reason this scenario likely focuses on Hancock is because this is where he got his reputation. One other thing we can see here on the side of the screen, you can get an order of battle. So essentially the magenta, purple, whatever color on the outside represents the division level. Then to the right, different units are represented by different colors. To the right of that line on the far left, like the light blue there was Hancock's brigade. But as I was mentioning here on the bottom left earlier, you've got a strength ratio, so it tells you the number of men. It also tells you the morale, where you started and where you're at, and as well as your supply, which kind of represents bullets, how much movement, your status on whether you can move. There's also junior officers represented, 10 of 10, so it looks like all 10 are healthy. And you've also got a tab there that gives you information on the weapon that you're using. So the game is highly detailed, even goes into regimental commanders. In some ways, it reminds me of Civil War Generals 2, which I think to this day is still one of the best Civil War games of all time. And in some ways, it reminds me of the Battlegrounds series, which are just these ultra groggy, ultra complex and detailed tactical level games that were made. I want to say John Tiller was involved with them. But it's kind of an interesting mesh between the two. The one thing I will say is the look and appeal of the game is far more appealing than I would say much of what you'll still see today for John Tiller's. Nothing against anyone who's a John Tiller fan. I know there's a lot of you out there. I will admit I haven't given the games maybe as big of a chance as I should have. I have the Peninsula campaign game of it, but I just have never... It's hard. It's been hard for me to get into it. I'm not going to claim to be like this ultra hardcore wargamer. I don't often have the time to sit down and get into a game that I haven't played before as much as I would like to. And they're definitely something I want to look into, but I'd say the biggest difference, or one of the biggest difference between the Tiller games and this is, one, the user interface on this just seems so much more simple. So many few, you know, you don't have a whole bunch of, heck, I guess, not nearly as many buttons. It's a lot easier to get into, even if, you know, this is playing on the easier difficulty. But the other difference, I would say, is the scale, at least at this point in time. Tiller games tend to focus on much larger engagements or campaigns, you know, the Waterloo campaign, the Peninsula campaign. Each one of those battles, for the most part, is bigger than, I think, maybe the only one in this game that would come close would be Manassas. But this game's obviously focusing on smaller engagements, which I really think will suit this particular game better. As you can see here, I'm starting to take some heavy casualties, but also inflict some pretty darn heavy casualties on this Confederate regiment on the bottom right here, which we've got 2 regiments up against. But yeah, I think this game is really suited to smaller engagements, so I'll be interested to see. I know they said they're looking at moving into the 1862 battles and possibly even the Peninsula campaign, but I'd be interested to see how the game will play out as battles get bigger and bigger and bigger. You know, this kind of focus on a regimental scale, I think could be very difficult to model in a way that doesn't really limit who the game appeals to and limit the approachability. I think the brilliant thing of Brother Against Brother here, in my admittedly very limited experience thus far, has been just how easy it is. This is literally the very first time I've picked up and played it. I think I watched like 20 minutes of the, not the live stream that Slitherine did for the game, but kind of watched the video on demand of it afterwards. And I just picked the game up, started playing, and, you know, I guess I shouldn't be speaking too soon. I'm, what, 2 turns in, or about to be 3 turns in? But it doesn't seem too imposing. There's definitely a lot of detail. There's a lot that you're certainly going to have to learn to be good at the game. But again, this doesn't feel like a game that would scare me away. There's a whole bunch of detail, as we said. The firefight details are enormous. The amount of rules underneath the hood, the amount to learn to be excellent at this game, to be able to be good against another human player is probably a monumental feat and a monumental challenge. But with that being said, the game wouldn't scare me away based on what I'm seeing here. I do think if you were playing a massive battle, if you were trying to model Gettysburg at the regimental level, I think you'd run into some problems. But, you know, that's, I guess, me speculating. So far, I'm pretty darn impressed with this. I believe you can also change your settings so that you can exclude the combat details, the firefight details there in the bottom, and kind of make the turns go a little bit quicker. That's something I want to see, just in case something happens that surprises me. I want to know why, if I can take a look at it. And it's something I think that's interesting that not enough games do, where they provide you all that detail. But that is what it's worth, you know, for what it's worth. That's an option there. Up on the top left, you get a summary between infantry. You've got, you know, 3,492 infantry on one side, 3,922 on the other. You can see the Confederate and the Union summary of their strength. I want to say the right number, 3,500, for example. I can't really show you on my mouse while we're moving through this turn, but that represents the starting value, and then on the left side of that dash represents the current values. So you can see the Confederates started with 3,900 infantry, they're down to 3,800, and the Federals started with 35 down to 34. Cavalry in this case has to include staff because the Union has no cavalry units on there, so they must include the staff of the generals. Guns includes artillery, and infantry is obviously self-explanatory, is infantry. You can see here, smoke is really starting to become a problem. It certainly impacts the quality of the troops that you're fighting with, the engagement, the ability of them to fight effectively. That's one of the modifiers there. You can see here as I move to the bottom of the screen and look at our different options. My charge is set to never, so I think I'm going to go ahead and set it to May. As I mentioned, there's 3 options there. So essentially, I want them to charge if they can charge profitably. Meanwhile, the 49th Pennsylvania Infantry, I'm going to move them to the south of the 6th South Carolina to threaten their rear. Also give them the option of charging if that option presents itself. Now, the 49th doesn't present the best frontage right now. They're faced kind of the wrong direction, but they're getting around to the rear of the Confederates. So that should be an opportunity there, hopefully, for us to drive that unit out of their redoubt, which is, you know, an entrenched kind of mini fort of earthworks. Meanwhile, our 33rd New York is making progress to blocking our flank. And the smoke continues to build up in the vicinity of our engagements thus far. I can only imagine that the rain would have kind of another effect. I don't know if there's weather. Well, no, there is weather effects. I remember that being brought up in the live stream. That weather does also influence the ability for your troops to fight effectively. And there you go. You can see kind of a brief write-up, in this case, of the Springfield rifle, which our 5th Wisconsin Infantry is armed with. As I said, the game models individual weapons, even goes as far as to model junior officers. So, you know, as your unit starts taking casualties, maybe some of your general or junior officers begin to fall, then that will limit the effectiveness of your infantry. Now, the one reason I mentioned that the reason that I picked Williamsburg is because it's a scenario that involved Hancock, who's an officer who really fascinates me in many ways. He kind of strikes me as kind of like the Longstreet of the North, if you really want to look at him that way. You know, he's very aggressive, which Longstreet's reputation doesn't really hold to him being aggressive, but he certainly was an incredible attacker. And so was Hancock. You see numerous examples, especially in 1864, of Hancock just launching these very well crafted, very well thought out attacks, very powerful attacks, almost always getting the better of his Confederate opponents. Very similar to Longstreet in his record as a general in the South. Hancock's reputation really started to be built here at the Battle of Williamsburg, where I've already mentioned it, but essentially he took his brigade and took this long circuitous route around the Confederate flank, which was based at Williamsburg and some very heavy earthworks. He marched to the north, where there was a kind of a dam or a reservoir that had a very narrow crossing where part of a river was dammed up a bit. Confederates didn't defend that. He marched up and around the Confederate flank and then came down on the northern edge of the Confederate line, their left flank, endangering the Confederate forces in Williamsburg and essentially helping to compel them to retreat. Not that General Joseph Johnston, who was in command of the Confederate Army, needed any reason to retreat. I believe he was already planning to retreat by that point. But Williamsburg was kind of the first of the bigger engagements that took place in the Peninsula Campaign. There were about 70,000 troops all told, I believe, engaged, something like 30 or 40,000 Confederates and 30 or 40,000 Union troops, most of which were attacking further south here against some pretty heavy earthworks. But here in the north, the Confederates lost pretty heavily. They had a regiment that was just absolutely mauled. D.H. Hill had a quote, who was a Confederate commander at the time, basically talking about how that was just such a foolish attack and was something that he could not think of, even after the war, could not think of the engagement without thinking of the horror that the Confederate regiment that he was talking about went through. I'm not sure which regiment. I want to say the 5th or 6th South Carolina, which we're in the process of absolutely mauling right now. You can see here we did launch an attack on the redoubt number 9 there on the right with our 6th Maine Infantry, and we did drive them back while I was kind of chit-chatting about Hancock. Oh, one other thing worth mentioning, Hancock got the name Hancock the Superb from General McClellan, who was in command of the Union Army at this time, from this particular engagement. That's where he got the nickname the Superb, Hancock the Superb, and that kind of followed him for the rest of his career and was quite a fitting nickname, if you might ask me, as again, he was one of the stalwart Union Corps commanders, one of the best Corps commanders in either army throughout the war. You can see here we got another update. The 6th South Carolina has panicked. Part of Steedman's battalion has panicked and is forced to retreat. The 5th Wisconsin Infantry is making an exploitation move, and essentially it's kind of like a breakthrough move in kind of more World War II combats where they move without you telling them to move. They basically just move into the position of the old unit to represent them filling the spot of where the enemy retreated. You can, again, get more detailed information on those engagements with a little pop-up here that comes up if you want to know, the details of the fight. But I'm not going to bother going through all of those here in this particular video. Just suffice to know we drove the 6th South Carolina back up near the north. They were just driven back basically by fire, whereas in Redoubt number 9, we drove the Confederate forces there back at the point of a bayonet with a charge that was pretty costly in terms of manpower, but allowed us to carry the position. And remember, a redoubt is a fort, so it's a very strongly defended position. If we scroll down here, we'll see in this turn another 18 casualties for us, but 43 for the Confederates. We're at nearly 2-to-1 Confederate to Union casualties. I'd be interested to see how a higher level of difficulty might influence casualties and maybe making it much more difficult for us, I assume. I'm just not sure exactly what. You know, I'm not sure if difficulty is reflected in modifiers that make casualties harsher on you and easier on the enemy, or if it's resulted more in just a smarter AI or some kind of combination of that. But we're going to go ahead and shift these guys out of charging orders now that we drove the Confederates out of the 9th Redoubt. You can see they're to the west. The 6th South Carolina is kind of reforming, which I think they're split into multiple units, so I'm not sure if that's the one we drove back by musket fire or the one we drove back by the point of the bayonet. It's hard for me to really say. But again, we're moving here. We've started to drive in the Confederate right flank on this little line, as well as the Confederate left flank, although their left does have another regiment here, the 5th North Carolina, coming up. The 4th is also in our way, so more obstacles on our left. On our right, we've got 3 regiments, 2 regiments in place, 1 more coming into place, and only a kind of shattered Confederate regiment and some artillery in our way. So really a chance to potentially turn the Confederate line. Hopefully, at least, that's what our goal is. And we finally got the 33rd New York Corning's Battalion into place on that roadway to block any Confederate attempt to get around our own flank. One feature I really enjoy with the game as well is these little arrows that represent where you're moving in this given turn. They really help give you a sense of understanding of what's going on. And yeah, anyway, that's going to about do it for this video, guys. I appreciate you tuning in. Hope you enjoy my first look at Brother against Brother, the drawing of the sword. I'm going to go ahead and certainly finish this battle up and maybe do one of the bigger battles as well as kind of a Let's Play type thing. Just kind of feeling my way through the game. Again, I just basically watched 20 minutes of the video, pulled the game up, and started playing it myself. And quite a fun first scenario. I really like the scale, I really like the approach, and the look of the game as well. There's a lot more information to go over, but not this time. This time, that's going to just about do it. So I want to thank you all for watching, and until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.